Welcome to this year's LGBTQ Summit, hosted by the Office of LGBTQ Affairs, the Division of Equity and Social Justice. And we're so delighted to bring you SupportOUT, which is an organization that we'll talk about shortly, but pleased to see each and every one of you here today. Before we get started, I want to just acknowledge and say to each and every one of you, happy Transgender Awareness Week. We are in the stretch to Transgender Awareness Week, and it's celebrated a week before Trans Day of Remembrance, which is happening next week on November 20th. So for more information, there's a lot of stuff happening on social, but make sure to follow us on our social channels, which we'll put in the links later today. Without further ado, I want to introduce Board President Cindy Chavez from the County of Santa Clara Board of Supervisors, who's going to give them some short words. Thank you for joining us today, President Chavez, and I'll pass it off to you.
Thank you very much, Sarah. And I am really excited to be with all of you. I'm really honored. And I'm so happy that today you're focusing on the challenges of our youth, our LGBTQ youth. And, as we dream about and think about the future, it's been really a challenging time because of COVID-19. Everything that people are experiencing is even worse than normal. What we know is that in 2017, there was a groundbreaking study done by the Human Rights Campaign Foundation of over 12,000 young LGBTQ folks across the country and their families. We know that children feel and young people are feeling a lot of anxiety, a lot of isolation. We know that they really need their families and they need strong networks around them, and they told us that. And we also know that only 26 or 27% of them say they feel safe in their classroom. So the work that you're doing is work that we're going to be relying on. We want your insight, we want your thoughts, we want to better learn and better understand how we go to the next level. One of the things I've been watching at a national level is the who's authentic and who's not, and whose voice do we need to hear. The fact of the matter is all of our voices matter, all of them. And we need to really dig in deep, dream about the future, and then as a community, make it happen. Let me say one thing about our Office of LGBTQ Affairs. These are leaders that are all about making it happen. And I couldn't be more honored to be part of not just the group of our beautiful Division of Social Equity, but of this team in particular. Insight, energy, focus. I'm so proud of them, and I know you're going to love working with them. Thank you for letting me join you. I'm going to listen in for a bit.
Hey, thank you so much, President Chavez, and thank you for those wonderful words. So yeah, also during today's session, we understand that the topics today might be triggering and it might surface emotions and feelings. And we want you to know that we do have county resources available should you need any of that kind of support. So for peer support, we have a close colleague of mine and Office of LGBTQ Affairs. We have Emmett Marsh from the Q Corner, also here available for peer support. So Emmett, go ahead and take it away.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Emmett Marsh. Like Sarah said, I use he and they pronouns, and I am the current mental health peer support worker with the Q Corner, which is a new program through the Behavioral Health Services Department of the County of Santa Clara, focusing on supports, referrals, and resources and other peer support for the LGBTQ community within our county. So I'll be here all day today. If anybody needs any peer support, you can send me a private message or send me an email at the Q Corner, which is in the chat, and I can get back to you. If you want to leave a phone number, if you just want to chat through email, just send me a message and I'll be here to support or provide any additional resources. Thank you so much for having me here today.
And thank you so much. We are also grateful to have you here today, Emmett, for peer support. So if you folks don't know me by now, my name is Sarah. I use she, her pronouns, and I will be your host today for this year's LGBTQ 2020 Summit. Today's first session, I want to bring up Shannon Wilbur. So Shannon Wilbur is a youth policy director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. She has been a child advocate for 30 years, starting her career at Legal Advocates for Children and Youth. Shannon works nationally to promote the health and well-being of LGBTQ youth in child welfare and juvenile justice system, and she brings that expertise and perspective to the SupportOUT initiative. Everybody, please welcome Shannon Wilbur. We also have, oh, hey, Shannon, welcome. We also have Maribel Martinez. Maribel Martinez is the founding director of the Office of LGBTQ Affairs for the County of Santa Clara. Maribel has spent the last 20 years working with various nonprofits in Santa Clara County, addressing community issues and public policy. Additionally, her efforts in Santa Clara County include working toward a county-wide equity framework, including the response and recovery planning efforts related to COVID-19. Everybody give it up for Maribel Martinez.
Hi, everyone. Good morning.
All right. And I'll let you folks take it away.
Thank you, Sarah, and good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for showing up today to learn about SupportOUT, which is an initiative to promote the well-being of low-income LGBTQ youth of color. We're so excited to see so many people interested in this critical work and to hear from several people throughout the day who will help inform the direction of the work going forward. As Sarah said, my name is Shannon Wilbur. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the Youth Policy Director at the National Center for Lesbian Rights. For those of you who may not be familiar with NCLR, we're a national legal organization that advances the rights of LGBTQ folks across the country through litigation, public policy advocacy, and public education. NCLR actually has a long history with Santa Clara County. We've worked closely with the county, along with other jurisdictions, to promote fair and affirming policies and practices in child welfare and juvenile justice systems. And we are honored to partner with the Office of LGBTQ Affairs to create and implement SupportOUT. Before I tell you more about the initiative, I want to acknowledge some folks who have been instrumental in the initiative's creation. Over 5 years ago now, I met with Chief Garnett, Supervisor Ken Yeager, and John Mills from the County Executive's office. And we had a conversation about the foundational work underway in the county at that time on behalf of LGBTQ youth in probation under Chief Garnett's leadership. And we wanted to promote that work, to broaden it, to promote the health of LGBTQ youth in their homes, in their schools, in their communities. With the support and leadership of Supervisor Yeager, the board created the Office of LGBTQ Affairs and shortly thereafter hired Maribel Martinez as its director, my co-collaborator and partner in this initiative. The office, along with critical partners, has incubated this initiative over these last several years. So I want to just take the opportunity to thank and appreciate the Board of Supervisors, the Office of the County Executive, the team of county employees who attended the 2016 Georgetown Certificate Program, yay team, and many of whom are participating in the planning committee for this summit. And in particular, Maribel and her team at the office for all of your work and the support it's taken to get us to this day. Finally, I want to thank our initiative partners, Rhodes Perry, who's a national expert on building inclusive organizations, and Series Policy Research, whose team generated some of the important data you're going to hear about today, and both of whom you're going to hear from later in today's program. Is the slideshow queued up? Slides? Because I don't see them. Perfect, thank you. So next slide, please. The focus of SupportOUT is on well-being. For many years now, we have worked to build systems that protect LGBTQ youth from bullying and suicide, that treat them fairly and equally, and respect their identities. This has been really important and good work, and we're proud of it. But we decided we wanted to up our game. We wanted to build a community in which low-income LGBTQ youth of color can reach their highest potential, experience belonging and connection, and participate fully in their lives. Of course, this is what we want for all of our children, but some have been deprived of these opportunities. Next slide, please. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thank you. So I wanted to just take, back to the guiding principles. There we go. I wanted to just take a minute to talk about the principles that are guiding this work going forward. And these are principles, of course, that will look familiar to all of you because they're fueling and supporting some of the most critical social movements of our time. Namely, that creating well-being, especially for marginalized groups of people, requires structural changes. And how we're defining that for the purposes of this initiative are here on the slide. Access to basic necessities, health, food, stable housing, economic security, quality education, and above all, connection to one's culture and family and community. An intentional approach that acknowledges the healing and trauma caused by structural racism, heterosexism, and transphobia, and fully and authentically embracing anti-racist and gender-affirming attitudes and practices and policies as part of this work going forward. Providing opportunities for young people. And I think this principle really goes to belonging. Opportunities to develop competence, to participate in social activities, to take responsibility when you make a mistake, and to contribute to their communities. A broad safety net with a continuum of services that permits us to tailor services to the unique needs of each young person and family, which are accessible to families and young people geographically, culturally, and practically. And finally, that we center the people whose lives are affected by decisions, young people and their families, that they lead in these decisions. So those are sort of, and we'll maybe refer back to them as we talk about the work going forward today. Next slide, please. So you might ask, why are we focusing very specifically on this population, low-income LGBTQ youth of color? And the reason is because these young people live at the intersections of several forms of bias, and they're very marginalized and living on the edges of many of our opportunities. They are overrepresented among youth who are living apart from their families, who are disconnected from education, who are experiencing homelessness or unstable housing, involved in child welfare or juvenile justice systems, or suffering from untreated health or mental health conditions. So in addition to the guiding principles and the purpose of our initiative, the focus, our initiative is also shaped by data. And my job gives me a national perspective on the status of LGBTQ youth of color. And I want to share some national data And it's just a small part of it, but just to provide some context. Next slide, please. So this slide represents some data that was generated by a study done by Series Policy Research, and shows quite starkly that although young LGBTQ youth represent somewhere between 7 and 9% of the general population, they represent fully 20% of young people in juvenile justice systems. Boys about 14%, and female identified youth at 40, a full 40%, which is an incredible overrepresentation. Keeping in mind always that these youth are also youth of color, 85% nationally. Next slide, please. Similarly, we see in foster care, this data came from the first study, and there's been several since then that are very similar. This came out of the foster care system in Los Angeles County, which is obviously a large county. And we see that of the young people surveyed here, a full 19.1% identified as LGBTQ. Again, a huge overrepresentation compared to their numbers in the general population. And I'm going to go over this quickly, but I want to point out in this slide as well that youth who identified as transgender were 5.6% of those surveyed, which is probably at least 5 times their number in the general population. So an even greater overrepresentation. Next slide, please. LGBTQ youth are also very significantly overrepresented among youth experiencing homelessness. We see data that shows somewhere between 25 and 40% of folks who identify as homeless or unstably housed also identify as LGBTQ. This was a study out of Chapin Hall in Chicago that showed that LGBTQ youth were 2.2 times as likely to report experiencing homelessness as their straight counterparts. Next slide, please. Again, I want to just point out the racial disparities among youth experiencing homelessness, LGBTQ youth. You see at the far end of the slide here that youth who were both Black and LGBTQ reported the highest rates of homelessness. Next slide, please. And finally, I guess I have a couple slides here. Finally, bullying. We know that that young people, LGBTQ youth in schools very often experience a hostile environment, and that's been demonstrated in study after study. Next slide. And there is a very close correlation, tragically, between bullying experienced by young people and either completed suicides or suicidality. And I know that this is very sobering and discouraging information, but it's important for us to understand why it gives us a reason to understand why this work is so important and why it's critically important to focus on LGBTQ youth of color. And now I'm going to turn it back to Sarah to introduce Maribel, who's going to give us some local flavor.
Thank you so much, Shannon. So up next we have Maribel, who is going to briefly go over some of the work that we're doing here locally. So take it away, Maribel.
Hi, good morning. Buenos dias. Iskashkitata kuresh primei muntaka. We thank everyone who's here and all those who have come before us as we enter this work. As Sarah said, my name is Maribel Martinez. I'm the director for the Office of LGBTQ Affairs here for the County of Santa Clara. I identify as a queer, Latinx, Chicanx, Indigenous, person of color. And it's really wonderful to have an entire community, local government who is working together to integrate approaches. And so in Santa Clara County, I think many believe is one of the most LGBTQ friendly regions of the state, if not the nation. And so our county is using data to understand local and national landscapes of LGBTQ experiences and resources. We're also using this data to identify entry points into public systems, to address bias and gaps in these systems, and most importantly, to give visibility and amplify the voices of low-income LGBTQ youth of color. Next slide. When we look at our public school, and this data is from the California Healthy Kids Survey here in Santa Clara County, majority of the public school students are students of color. Next slide. And when we look at large school districts and we look at youth sexual orientation by race, we also see that LGBTQ LGB students for this particular data set are also students of color. Next slide. In Santa Clara County, our data, you might expect it to be better, but it's actually reflective of the national data in some ways that Shannon shared, that about 40% of LGB high school students have seriously attempted suicide in the last year, compared to just 5.4% of their straight counterparts. They're experiencing suicide ideation and suicidality to a higher extent. Of LGB youth in public middle and high schools, 68% are experiencing bullying in the last year compared to 27%. So this is almost double here, more than double. And 30% of youth experiencing homelessness identify as LGBTQ. So again, looking at some similarity in terms of the national numbers and the numbers here in Santa Clara County. Next slide. Only 31% of LGBTQ middle and high school students have felt safe at home, at school, and in their neighborhoods. Only 19% of LGBTQ middle and high school students showed high self-esteem, and only 22% LGBTQ middle and high school students reported positive family communication. And that's here in Santa Clara County. Next slide. When we look at developmental assets for youth here in Santa Clara County, our LGBTQ students fall under the asset level of vulnerable. And some of those alarming findings include that they average only 18 out of the 40 developmental assets compared to 21.4 in comparison to all other students. They're about 1.5 more likely to use drugs and alcohol. Only 11% feel valued by the community. And LGBTQ youth overall were higher in 23 out of the 24 risk behaviors, and they were lower in 6 out of the 7 thriving indicators. Next slide. We also know that there are huge data gaps in terms of standardized data collection for SOGI, sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression, particularly in foster care, in juvenile justice, and children and family serving programs. This is one of the areas that we need to strengthen and build a more robust database to ensure that we are actually capturing the data that we need to make the changes that are important to the well-being of LGBTQ youth. Next slide. What we also know in Santa Clara County is that there might be some potential language access challenges or school navigation challenges, because a large majority of public school students have foreign-born parents. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're less equipped or less accepting. It just means that in our distribution of information, of support services, we have to have them be culturally responsive and culturally sensitive and have multiple language access points. Next slide. I think many of us have seen the hierarchy of needs, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that says that we have to start with the physiological, room, shelter, food, and then work our way to self-actualization. But actually, social scientists now are actually challenging this notion. Next slide. And we're actually thinking that sense of belonging is actually one of the first needs. And if we think about it, when we are children, when we are infants, it is that sense of belonging, a sense of belonging to our families, to our communities that actually give us access to food, shelter, and any of those basic needs. And if we are not connected to those communities, if we do not have a place to belong, we often go without. Next slide. So for the Support Out initiative, we're really centering on belonging. We are imagining a county where every single young person gets the message from every single institution that they belong, that they are of value, and that they have an endless possibility for their future. This is not an easy task, and it's not one that we can do in isolation. It requires all of us working together, collecting data, and building a robust network, a safety network, and messaging to make sure that we have an equity of messaging, particularly for low-income LGBTQ youth of color. There are so many messages out there that are negative. We have to not only match the number of messages, but we need to surpass them and embrace all of our young folks in this message of affirmation and belonging. What you'll hear today is the beginning of this work, and I hope that all of you on this webinar decide to join us in our efforts, because we definitely need an entire community to center on belonging. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maribel and Shannon, for that wonderful introduction of what Support Out is.